The ancient teachers had a name for it, katanyanyutta, a Pali word with no perfect English translation. It means something closer to knowing what has been done for you. Not gratitude as a feeling that comes and goes, but gratitude as a way of seeing a quiet revolution in how you meet the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. And tonight, as you lie here, something has already been done for you. Your heart is beating. Your lungs are filling with air. The darkness around you is holding you. Patient and unhurried, the way it has held every human being who has ever been tired at the end of a long day. Before we begin, we'd love to know, what time is it where you are? And what country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. There's something beautiful about knowing that people from so many different corners of the world find their way to these stories in the quiet hours. So take a moment, tell us where you are tonight, and then let everything else go. What the teachers of Korea's mountain monasteries, Vietnam's river temples, ancient India's forest paths, and China's cedar-scented hermitages discovered independently. Across centuries is this: the ungrateful mind is never truly at rest. It is always scanning, always measuring what it has against what it lacks, always comparing this moment to some imagined better one. The grateful mind, by contrast, has found its ground. It has stopped running. It has recognized that the flaw. This video offers contemplative stories drawn from Buddhist wisdom traditions created for rest and quiet reflection. Not medical or therapeutic advice. Simply old teachings for a tired evening. So settle in now. Let your weight fall fully into whatever is beneath you. Notice your breath without changing it. Notice the particular silence of this room at this hour, how it is different from every other silence you have ever sat inside. You are here. You arrived. The ancient teachers would say, that itself is worth seeing. Tonight, across 10 stories and 10 traditions, we will follow people who discovered what the grateful heart already knows, that what we have been given is far more than we have ever stopped to count. Let your eyes close when they choose. Let your thoughts come and go like guests in a well-lit inn. And let the first story begin to find you now, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour holds you in its hands. There is a particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from the body. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up exhausted, because what is tired is not the muscles or the bones, but something quieter and harder to name, the part of you that has spent years scanning the horizon for what is still missing, still wrong, still not quite enough. The part of you that has forgotten how to rest inside the present moment, because the present moment never felt like it had enough in it. This first story is for that tiredness. It comes to us from the forests of northeast Thailand. From the tradition of the Thai forest, masters a lineage of monks who gave up everything and walked into the wilderness to discover, slowly and without hurry, what it actually means to be alive. Her name was Niran. She was 29 years old, and she had been tired for so long, she no longer remembered what it felt like not to be. She had grown up in a rice farming village near Ubon Ratchathani, the youngest of 5 children in a family that was always stretching its money in one direction or another. Her father grew rice and kept chickens. Her mother sewed garments at night by lamplight after the cooking was done. There was always enough, just barely. Exactly enough, but somehow that had never felt like enough to Niran. even as a small girl sitting on the wooden steps of their house, watching fireflies rise above the paddies in the summer dark. She would feel a vague dissatisfaction she couldn't name, a sense that something important was happening elsewhere, to someone else, in some other life that was more vivid and complete than the one she was living. She had been a sharp student. Her teachers noticed, and her parents sacrificed to send her to the secondary school in the city, which meant bus fares and school fees and the pride of being the only one of their children to go so far in her education. She knew this. She was grateful, she told herself. She was grateful. But even then, she was already learning the habit of looking past what she had, toward what she didn't have yet, toward the university that came after secondary school, toward the job that came after the university, toward the apartment and the salary and the respect of people she hadn't yet met. She lived in the future the way some people live in the past, always arriving somewhere that then immediately became the next starting point. By 29, she had an administrative position at a hospital in the city, a small rented room with a window that looked onto the back wall of another building, a motorbike that started reliably in dry weather, and a gnawing feeling she could not explain to anyone. She wasn't unhappy. Exactly. But she wasn't happy either. She was simply busy, always moving, always planning, always measuring the gap between where she was and where she thought she should be. She had heard about the forest monastery outside the city the way most people in that region had heard about it, through the slow accumulation of stories passed between families at temple fairs and rice harvest celebrations. The monastery had been established in the lineage of the great teachers of the Thai forest tradition, whose monks lived simply in the dense teak and bamboo forests, walking the surrounding villages at dawn with their alms bowls, eating one meal a day, meditating long hours in small wooden huts raised above the forest floor. The abbot was an elderly monk named Luang Pordecha, who had been ordained for more than 40 years and who was known for saying very little and meaning everything he said. Niran did not go to the monastery looking for wisdom. She went because a colleague at the hospital had mentioned it offhandedly that the old monk there had once told her something that changed the way she understood her own mind and Niran, who had been sleeping poorly for weeks and who had developed a habit of waking at 3 in the morning with her heart already racing with the list of things she needed to do, thought that perhaps she would try it once, just to say she had been. She arrived on a Sunday morning in the cool season, when the air in the forest was still sharp and the light came through the high canopy of trees in long pale columns that shifted as the branches moved. The monastery path was swept earth, reddish-brown in the morning light, bordered by wild ginger plants whose leaves brushed her arms as she walked. Somewhere in the trees above her, a golden oriole was calling 3 clear notes, then silence, then 3 notes again. As if it had all the time in the world, she found a place to sit near the main sala, the open-sided hall where the monks gathered for morning chanting. She was early, and the monks had not yet returned from their alms round. She sat on a wooden bench and looked out at the forest and tried not to think about the report she needed to finish on Monday, the message she hadn't replied to, the question of whether she should apply for the position that was opening at the hospital administrator's office, which would mean more money but also longer hours and more responsibility, and, "You are carrying something heavy," said a voice. She turned. The old abbot was sitting in a simple wooden chair not 3 meters away from her. She hadn't noticed him. He was thin and entirely still, wrapped in his saffron robe, his shaved head tilted very slightly as if listening to the forest. Niran opened her mouth and closed it again. Then she said, "I'm sorry. Luang Por, I didn't see you there. That happens, he said. He did not look at her with curiosity or pity. He simply looked at her the way the forest looked at everything attentively, without judgment, without needing anything to be different. I'm not sure what I'm carrying, she said, which surprised her, because she hadn't planned to say anything honest. No, he said. Most people aren't. They only know it is heavy. She sat with that for a moment. Through the trees, she could hear the soft footsteps of monks returning along the forest path. The quiet clink of the dark lacquer of their arms, bowls resting in the crook of their arms. May I ask Luang Por something? She said. Yes. I have everything I need, she said slowly. I have work. I have health. My family is well. But I feel she stopped. She was embarrassed. Empty, he said. She nodded. He was quiet for a long moment. One of the young monks was crossing the open ground between the kitchen pavilion and the main sala, moving slowly and deliberately, as if the act of walking itself was something worth attending to. Then Luang Por Decha said, tomorrow morning, before you do anything else, before you look at your telephone, before you plan your day, I want you to sit at the edge of your bed for 5 minutes and do only this. Count what you have been given, not what you have earned, not what you have worked for, what you have been given. She looked at him. I'm not sure I understand the difference. Your lungs were given to you. He said, you did not earn them. Your eyes were given. The farmers who grew the rice you ate for dinner last night given. The teacher who spent her evenings grading your papers when you were 12 given. The fact that there are words in your language for the feeling of emptiness so that you can name it and sit with it instead of drowning in it given. He paused. Count for 5 minutes. Then come back and tell me how far you got. She stayed at the monastery that morning through the monk's meal. And then she stayed through the late morning sitting period. And then it was midday, and the sun had burned the dew off the grass, and she realized she had been there for 3 hours and hadn't once thought about the report she needed to finish. She went back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. What she discovered, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, the way light changes in a room as the afternoon progresses, without your noticing any single moment of the change, was that her emptiness had never been caused by an absence. It had been caused by a way of looking. She had learned to look at her life the way a person looks at a map, to find where they haven't been yet, scanning, always for the blank spaces, the unchecked places, the territory not yet covered. And in doing so, she had looked past the extraordinary density of what was already there, past the breathing, past the heartbeat, past the evening light on the back wall of her building, which was, when she actually looked at it, a very specific and unrepeatable shade of amber at exactly 5:20 in October. One morning she arrived at the monastery to find Luang Por Decha seated in the sala with several of his senior monks. She waited at the edge of the open hall, not wanting to interrupt. After some time, he saw her and raised his hand in a small gesture of invitation. She sat down and he said, without preamble, "Did you count?" "I got to 32, she said. Before the 5 minutes was up. He nodded as if this were exactly right. "What happened when you stopped?" he asked. She thought about it. "I felt smaller," she said slowly. "But not in a bad way. Like how you feel when you step outside and realize how big the sky is. like I had been living in a very small room of my own thoughts and the window had just opened. He said, "The Pali word is katanyuta. It means knowing what has been done for you, not as a performance of politeness, not as an obligation, as a clear seeing. When the mind truly sees how much it has received, how many hands have touched the food it has eaten, how many lives have intersected to make this particular life possible, it becomes quiet. Not because it has been told to be quiet, because it has found its ground." She looked down at her hands in her lap, the hands she had never once thought to be grateful for, because they had always simply been there, working. "And the emptiness?" she asked. "Still there sometimes?" He said, not unkindly. "The habit of looking past what you have is old. But now you have a practice. Every time the emptiness comes, you count. Not to fix the emptiness, just to let the mind remember what it keeps forgetting." She bowed to him. When she straightened up, she found that she was looking at the forest around her, the teak trees with their broad leaves, the small ceramic figures of the Buddha placed at the base of a great old tree whose roots had broken the earth into waves, and she was seeing it, really seeing it, for the first time. Not as scenery, as gift. She drove home through the dusty afternoon, past the rice paddies, where egrets were walking slowly in the shallow water, past the roadside stalls, where women were selling pomelo and sugarcane and small bags of tamarind candy, past the school where children in white and navy uniforms were streaming out through a blue metal gate into the afternoon. She drove slowly, which she never did, and she watched all of it, the light, the dust, the children, the egrets, the particular way the wind moved through the palms at the edge of the road, and she counted. She never got through her list. There was simply too much to be grateful for. That evening, she sat at the edge of her bed for longer than 5 minutes. She sat there as the light in her room shifted from afternoon to the blue of early evening. She thought about her mother's hands under the lamplight, sewing. She thought about the bus driver who had carried her to school for 3 years without once failing to arrive. She thought about the old monk in the forest who had looked at her tiredness, not with impatience but with the same attention he gave the forest patient. Curious, completely without hurry. She thought, "I have been so busy looking at the map that I forgot I was standing inside the territory." And then, for the first time in years, she felt it not a dramatic burst of joy, nothing so loud as that. Just a quiet settling. The way a room settles after the last person has stopped moving. The way a river settles when the wind stops. Something in her that had been braced for so long simply released. She breathed in. She breathed out. The room was dim and warm and entirely sufficient. Outside her window, beyond the back wall of the other building, the sky had turned the color of old roses, and a single bird was calling from somewhere she couldn't see. Enough. The evening seemed to say, "This already. Enough." There is something the Thai forest masters understood about gratitude that most of us spend years forgetting and then slowly remembering. They understood that the mind that cannot rest is almost always the mind that has stopped noticing what is already here. Not because what is here is always pleasant. Not because there is no pain, no difficulty, no lack, but because the act of truly seeing, of counting what has been given, rather than cataloguing what is missing, changes the quality of awareness itself. It opens a space in the mind that was previously occupied by calculation. Katanyuta. Knowing what has been done for you. Think for a moment about this evening. Right now, as you lie here. The air you are breathing has arrived in your lungs without a single moment of effort on your part. Your heart has beaten, by some estimates, more than 30,000 times today. And you did not ask it to. And it did not require your attention or your gratitude to keep going. And yet, here it is, still working, faithfully, on your behalf. The bed beneath you, or the pillow under your head, someone made that. Someone cut the cotton, or wove the fabric, or drove the truck that carried it to the factory, or ran the machine that stitched it into the shape that now holds the weight of your exhaustion. 30, 40, 50 people may have touched the thread of your blanket before it reached you. You received all of that work. It was given. Let your shoulders fall a little more. Feel the weight of your body releasing into whatever is beneath you. The mind that scans for what is missing does not rest. It cannot. It is built for movement, for seeking, for the next gap and the next gap and the next. But the mind that sees what has been given, that mind, has somewhere to land. It has ground. And on that ground, something that feels very much like peace becomes possible. Not because all the problems are solved. Not because the morning will not bring its demands. But because right now, in this particular moment, the breath is here. The warmth is here. And if you count even just for a minute, even just 5 items on the list, you will find, as Niran found sitting at the edge of her bed in the amber light of a Thai October evening, that the list has no end. This is the practice. Just this. Knowing what has been done for you. Just this. Knowing. Just this. Let your breath be the evidence. Let your heartbeat be the reminder. Let the weight of your body sinking into the earth be the proof that you have been held, all along, by more than you have ever stopped to count. And as that awareness quietly opens in you now, as the mind begins to set down its clipboard and simply look, a new story begins to find us. We travel north, across the sea of time, to the mountain hermitages of medieval Korea, where a different kind of gratitude was being discovered in a very different kind of life. But the discovery was, at its heart, the same. It always is. Let your eyes grow heavier now. Let the breath slow. You don't need to stay awake for what comes next if sleep finds you here. Let it. You've already received tonight's first and most important teaching. The grateful heart has found its ground. The rest will come on its own. If you are the kind of person who lies awake cataloging your own inadequacy, if the last thing your mind does before sleep is assemble a quiet case against yourself, a list of ways you fell short today, the ways you have always fallen short, then this story is for you. It has been waiting a long time to reach you. It comes from the granite mountains of medieval Korea, from the tradition of the wandering Seon monks, who lived in small stone hermitages above the tree line and discovered, in the silence and the cold, something that most of us spend our entire lives trying not to look at directly. They discovered that what they had always been was already enough. His name was Hyunjun, and he had been running from himself for 11 years. He had entered the monastic life at 16. The second son of a minor government official in the southern province of Jeolla during the middle years of the Goryeo dynasty, that long, complicated century when Korean Buddhism was flowering and fracturing simultaneously. when great minds were arguing in the mountain temples about the nature of awakening and the proper relationship between meditation and scripture, and when young men from families of modest ambition sometimes found that the robes offered a kind of escape from the suffocating expectations of Confucian family life. That was not why Hyunjun had ordained. He had ordained, or so he told himself, because he had read the words of national teacher Jinul, the reformer who had died 2 generations before, who had founded the great mountain community at Songwangsa on Mount Tu, Yogi-san, and who had written with such precise clarity about the nature of the mind, and he had believed deeply and completely that he was capable of the kind of transformation those words described. He was wrong about how long it would take. 11 years later, Hyunjun was 37 years old, living in a 2-room stone hermitage on the northern slope of a mountain in the eastern region of the country. And he had still not had what the old texts called the great matter, that moment of sudden seeing when the Huadu, the questioning phrase that the practitioner held like a stone in the center of the chest, finally broke open and revealed what was underneath. He had practiced ardently. He had sat in meditation until his knees ached and his back sent long tremors of protest up his spine. He had worked with 3 teachers. The first had died. The second had sent him away when the monastery faced drought and could no longer feed all its monks. The third had listened to him describe his practice for 1 hour and then said, simply, "You are trying too hard," and had pointed him toward this mountain and left him to find out what that meant on his own. What he had found, so far, was mostly doubt. He was not a man who doubted easily. That was part of the problem. He was thorough, careful, persistent traits that had made him a good student of sutras and a capable cook in the monastery kitchen, and a reliable helper during the autumn kimchi-making seasons, when the whole community worked together through 3 consecutive days of salting and pressing and packing the great earthenware jars. But thoroughness applied to spiritual practice becomes a kind of slow torture, because the thorough man cannot stop assessing, cannot stop comparing his present state to the ideal state described in the texts, cannot stop noticing the gap, and the gap, for Hyunjun, had always been very wide. The hermitage sat at an elevation where the forest had thinned to scattered pine and exposed granite, where the wind came in long, cold waves from the northeast in the winter months, and where the summer was brief and vivid. The slopes covered in wild azalea and bracken fern, and the small yellow flowers whose name he had never bothered to learn because he had always been too focused on his practice to pay attention to flowers. His days had a simple structure. He rose before dawn. He chanted. He sat in meditation in the small main room where a single oil lamp burned through the dark hours. He ate whatever he had, usually barley or millet. Sometimes mountain greens he gathered from the slopes. Occasionally dried fish brought by the village family, 2 hours' walk below, who had adopted the hermitage as their object of merit-making, and who came every 10 days with provisions regardless of the weather. He slept 4 hours. Then he began again. He told himself he was grateful for this life. He said the words of the morning chants that included gratitude for the teaching, for the teacher, for the opportunity to practice. But inside, the words was something hollow, something that knew the gratitude was mostly performance. Because what Hyunjun felt, underneath the performance, was something that did not feel like gratitude at all. It felt like debt. He felt he owed the teachings something. He felt he owed his teachers something, the first one who had taken him in without asking why he'd come, the second who had fed him for 6 years from the monastery stores, the third who had given him a huadu and a pointed finger and the gift of his mountain. He felt he owed the village family something, the farmer Kim and his wife and their 3 children, who climbed the mountain path with their bundles every 10 days in all weather, expecting nothing in return but his continued presence and his prayers. He felt he owed his parents something, his ordination teachers, the builders of the hermitage who had set these stones into walls before he was born. He felt he owed the tradition itself, something the long lineage of teachers stretching back through Janul to the Chinese masters, back through time to the Buddha under the Bodhi tree in the hot plains of northern India. He owed so much, and he had given back so little. Just 11 years of mediocre practice and a mind that still chattered and complained and could not hold the huadu steadily for more than 20 breaths without some thought arriving to displace it. This was the shape of his suffering. Not dramatic, not acute, just this quiet, persistent, corrosive feeling that he was failing at the only thing that mattered. The winter he turned 37 was particularly cold. The mountain received early snow in the 10th month, and by the 11th month, the path to the village was buried under waist-deep drifts. The Kim family sent their eldest son up with provisions before the worst of it came. A boy of 14 with strong legs and a cheerful face, who arrived, stamping snow from his boots, and set down his load and looked around the hermitage with frank curiosity, as if a monk's dwelling was the most interesting thing he had ever encountered. "Your fire is small," the boy observed. "I have enough wood," Hyunjun said. The boy shook his head with the authority of someone who had grown up in the mountains. "Not for a cold like this one coming." He looked at the monk with an expression that held no pity and no condescension, just a practical observation offered freely. "My father says this will be the coldest winter in 20 years. He wants to know if you have enough." Hyunjun opened his mouth to say yes. Then he closed it, because when he looked at his woodpile, really looked at it, instead of the habitual reassuring glance that said, "Good enough," he saw that it was not enough. Not for 20 years of cold. "I may need more," he admitted. The boy nodded as if this were entirely reasonable, turned without another word, and walked back down the mountain through the snow. 3 days later, the Kim family arrived in full father, mother, eldest boy, and the 2 younger children carrying bundles of cut wood on their backs. The children's faces red with cold and bright with the importance of the task. They stacked the wood against the north wall of the hermitage and packed snow over the base to keep the wind from stealing the warmth. And the mother, a small woman with a quick economy of movement that reminded Hyunjun of a mountain bird, produced from her pack a sealed ceramic jar of radish kimchi that she set inside the hermitage door without comment. As if leaving food for a monk in a mountain snowstorm were a perfectly ordinary thing to do on an ordinary day. They stayed 2 hours, working, and then they prepared to go back down. Hyunjun stood in the doorway. He did not know what to say. He was not good at receiving. He was much better at owing. He said, "You have climbed a long way in hard weather. I have nothing to offer you." The farmer Kim, a broad-shouldered man with weathered hands and very steady eyes, stopped and looked at him. Not unkindly. The way a person looks at someone who has said something slightly confused. "Sunim," he said, using the honorific for monks. "We are not doing this to receive something." "I know," Hyunjun said, "but still, I have nothing to give." The farmer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When my wife was very ill 3 years ago, I climbed up here in the night and sat outside your door because I didn't know where else to go. I didn't knock. I just sat there. And in the morning I went home and she recovered." He paused. I don't know what you did that night. Maybe you were sleeping, but I needed to sit near something that was trying, near someone who had given everything to the practice. That was enough. That was more than I had anywhere else. He picked up his empty pack and began to walk down the mountain. His wife followed. The children followed. And the eldest boy, the last one, turned back once and looked at the monk standing in the doorway of the cold stone hermitage and gave a small, entirely uncomplicated bow, the bow of someone acknowledging something real, and then turned and was gone into the white of the mountain. Hyunjun stood in the doorway for a long time after they disappeared. He had given nothing. He had been asleep. He had not prayed or chanted or offered any particular merit on the night that Kim had sat outside in the darkness. He had simply been there, in his small stone hermitage on the northern slope of the mountain, failing to hold his huadu, sleeping his insufficient sleep, eating his barley, getting up before dawn and sitting in his cold main room with his single lamp, just trying, just being there, just being someone who had given everything, inadequate as everything was, to the practice. And that had been enough. That had been more than the farmer had anywhere else. He went inside and sat down on his meditation cushion. The fire was small, as the boy had said, but it was there, and the wood was stacked high against the north wall now, enough for 20 years of cold. And in the corner, the ceramic jar of radish kimchi held the warmth of the Kim family's hands that had made it, sealed it, carried it up through the snow. He sat. He breathed. He picked up the huadu, the question he had been carrying for 3 years, the question his teacher had given him and told him to hold and hold and hold without seeking an answer. Just holding, just breathing, just being present with the not knowing. And for the first time in 11 years, something in him stopped trying to be better than he was. He did not have a great awakening that afternoon. He did not suddenly pierce through the huadu and emerge on the other side into some luminous understanding. He simply sat in the cold room with the small fire and the stacked wood outside and the sealed jar of kimchi in the corner, and he felt for, perhaps the first time since he had entered the robes at 16, something he could only describe later as the feeling of being in the right place. Not because the place was perfect, not because he had become what he was trying to become, but because what was here, this cold room, this fire, this practice, this inadequate and persistent and genuine trying was real. And real, it turned out, was something. Real was actually quite a lot. He sat until the light in the one small window turned from white to the pale grey of late afternoon. He sat until the fire needed feeding, and he fed it. He sat until the mountain settled into the particular deep quiet that comes only in heavy snow. A silence so complete it feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something larger than sound. Something that holds sound the way the ocean holds. A stone dropped into it, accepting, indifferent to the weight, unchanged. He breathed. He felt the cold on his face and the warmth of the fire on his chest and the rough texture of the meditation cushion beneath him. He noticed the smell of the stone walls and the faint sweetness of the pine wood burning and the distant but distinct smell of the kimchi in its sealed jar. He was not enlightened. He was not even particularly calm. But he was grateful. Not the performed gratitude of the morning chants. Not the obligatory gratitude of someone keeping a mental ledger of debts. Something simpler and much stranger, a gratitude for being exactly this. Exactly this, monk in exactly this hermitage, on exactly this mountain, in exactly this insufficient, genuine, ongoing, incomplete life. He would practice for many more winters on that mountain. He would carry the Huadu through cold and heat and the long, inconclusive middle seasons. There would be days of startling clarity and long weeks of dullness and confusion. He would never be quite sure whether he had seen through his great question or merely learned to carry it more gently. But he would always remember the afternoon the Kim family climbed through the snow with their wood and their kimchi and left him standing in the doorway with the understanding that being present fully, genuinely present, even in an inadequate and incomplete way, is itself a kind of offering, and that the offering is received, even when the giver is asleep. The Korean Sion masters understood something about gratitude that our modern minds resist, because it undoes one of our most deeply held beliefs. We believe that gratitude must be earned, that before we are allowed to receive with open hands, we must have done something worthy of receiving. We must have achieved, accomplished, become enough. And until that threshold is crossed, the gifts arrive, but we hold them at arm's length, calculating whether we deserve them, making lists of what we still owe. Hyunjun held the gifts at arm's length for 11 years. For 11 years he stood in the doorway of what was being freely given and said, "I cannot accept this yet. I have not yet become enough to accept this." And one winter afternoon, a 14-year-old boy with strong legs and a frank gaze told him his fire was small and did not wait for him to deserve the help. Let your shoulders fall a little further now. Feel the breath moving in and out without any effort on your part. What if the gratitude were not something you had to earn? What if it was simply a seeing a clear, unguarded, looking at what is already here? The warmth that exists in this moment. The air that asks nothing in return for filling your lungs. The fact that somewhere in the world, someone who does not know you is, at this very moment, doing something that will eventually make its way to you, growing food, repairing infrastructure, teaching a child who will one day become a doctor or a teacher, or simply a stranger who holds a door open at the right moment. You are held by more than you know. You have been held all along. Just this monk on his mountain. Just trying. Just being present with the not knowing. That is enough. That is already enough. Let this settle somewhere below thought now. Below words. Into the place where the body knows what the mind keeps forgetting. You don't need to have become anything yet. You are already inside the gift. And as that quiet understanding finds its ground in you as the mountain settles into its deep snow silence, another story waits for us. We cross the sea of centuries now, moving south and west toward the warm river valleys of ancient China, where a Chan master was teaching his students something unexpected about the ordinary cup of tea sitting in front of them. Rest here a moment. Let your body grow heavier. Let the breath do its work. If your eyes are closing now, let them close. The river is carrying us gently. You don't need to watch where we go. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes not from darkness but from speed. It is possible to move through an entire day, an entire life, surrounded by gifts you never receive, because you are moving too quickly to open them. Your hands are full of plans. Your eyes are already 3 steps ahead of your feet. And the extraordinary thing happening right now, in this very moment, passes through you like wind, through a screen door, present for an instant, and then gone without a trace. The Chan masters of Tang dynasty China understood this blindness with the precision of surgeons. They worked in the mountains and in river valley monasteries and in the bustling courtyards of temples where merchants and government officials came seeking wisdom. And what they found again and again, across hundreds of years and hundreds of students, was that almost no one could actually be where they were. Almost everyone, upon arriving, had already mentally left. This story is inspired by that tradition. It takes place in the 8th century, in a monastery on a mountain in Hunan province. During the reign of the Tang dynasty, that golden age of Chinese civilization, when poetry and Buddhism and the art of tea had woven themselves into a single thread of culture so dense and beautiful that monks wrote verses on the promer walls of their sleeping quarters, and emperors sent gifts of fine tea to mountain abbots, as one might send flowers to a teacher. The monastery was called Qingxin-si, the Temple of the Clear Heart, and it sat on the lower slope of a mountain where the forest was full of bamboo and old cedar. And where, in the early morning, the cloud lines settled just below the ridge, so that the monks walking to the meditation hall moved through white mist that tasted faintly of pine resin and stone. The abbot was a Chan master named Hui Yuan, who had been in robes for 40 years and who was known throughout the province for two things: his inexhaustible patience and his absolute refusal to explain anything twice. Into this monastery, in the autumn of the 43rd year of the Kaiyuan era, came a merchant named Wei Mingji. Wei Mingji was 34 years old and had spent the last 12 years building a successful trading business in silk and lacquerware between the cities of Changsha and Guangzhou. He was not a stupid man, he was, in fact, extraordinarily intelligent. The kind of intelligence that worked like a well-oiled machine, processing information, identifying patterns, calculating advantages with a speed that left slower minds blinking in his wake. He had educated himself through years of reading, maintained friendships with scholars and artists, memorized large sections of the classical texts, and had recently begun, at the urging of a Buddhist friend whose calm he admired and could not replicate, to seek out teachers of the Dharma. He had visited 2 monasteries before Qingxin-si. The first abbot had spoken too slowly for Wei Mingji's attention, and he had found himself finishing the old monk's sentences in his head, ahead of the words, so that by the time the teaching arrived, he was already somewhere beyond it. The second monastery had given him texts to copy, and he had copied them with speed and precision, and had understood them intellectually, but had felt nothing, no shift, no opening, no change in the quality of the restlessness that lived just below his sternum like a low and constant fire. He arrived at Qingxin-si on a Tuesday afternoon in the 10th month, when the maples on the lower slope were turning and the air smelled of wood smoke and wet stone. He had walked the last 3 hours of the journey. His horse left in the village below, and his lungs were still adjusting to the elevation when a young monk showed him to a simple guest room and told him that the abbot would receive him in the morning. Wei Mingji sat in his room and watched the light change. He reviewed what he planned to ask. He organized his questions in order of importance, decided which were most pressing, prepared the way he would frame each one to demonstrate both his sincerity and his existing knowledge. He lay down but did not sleep. His mind was already conducting the morning's interview. At dawn, he was shown to the tea room beside the abbot's quarters, a small room with a low wooden table, 2 cushions, a ceramic brazier holding coals, and a clay teapot from which a thread of steam rose with the unhurried patience of incense smoke. The master Hui Yuan was already seated. He was a small man with large hands and a face so deeply lined it looked like a landscape seen from above. Every year of his practice etched into the topography of his expression. He did not look up when Wei Mingji entered. Wei Mingji bowed, sat, and began immediately. He had questions. He had studied. He explained. He'd been working with the concept of the present moment, but found it difficult to maintain. His mind would arrive and then immediately begin preparing for the next thing, which was a problem he believed was connected to his work, which required constant forward planning. And he wondered whether the master could speak to the relationship between planning and presence, and whether the Buddha's teaching on non-attachment applied specifically to the attachment to outcomes, which was something he needed to understand, because "You are holding your teacup," Haiyuan said. Wei Mingji stopped. He looked down. His right hand was indeed wrapped around the ceramic cup that had been placed in front of him. He had not noticed picking it up. He had not noticed it being poured. "Yes," he said. "Is it hot or cold?" the master asked. Wei Mingji felt the cup. Warm. Quite warm. Actually closer to hot than he had expected. The heat moving through the ceramic in a slow wave that reached his palm and then the inside of his fingers, and then, as he paid attention, he became aware of the faint damp heat against his lips where they rested at the rim. "Warm," he said. "Nearly hot. What does it smell like?" He hadn't noticed. Now he did. Earthy, a deep, mineral earthiness, undercut by something green and slightly astringent. And beneath that, a sweetness that was not quite sweet. More the suggestion of sweetness. The ghost of it. The way a word carries the trace of its meaning even when whispered. "Like soil," he said slowly. "And something green. And under that, something I don't have a word for." "Put the cup down," Haiyuan said. He put it down. "Now tell me your questions." Wei Mingzi opened his mouth and found, to his considerable surprise, that the questions had become slightly less urgent. Not gone, they were all still there, arranged in their careful order, but something had shifted in the space between him and them. Some gap of perspective had opened that had not been there a moment ago. "What did you do?" he asked. Haiyuan looked at him without particular expression. "I asked you about your tea." Wei Mingji sat with that. Then he said, "I wasn't here when I arrived." "No," the master agreed. "I was preparing for the conversation I planned to have." "Yes. And I missed the conversation I was actually having." Haiyuan picked up his own cup and drank from it slowly, with the attention of someone for whom the act of drinking tea was genuinely, entirely, worthy of attention. Not as a performance of mindfulness. As a simple fact, this tea, this morning, this specific meeting of warmth and earthiness and the quiet of a mountain before the day has fully committed to itself. "In my experience," the old monk said, setting his cup down, "most people who come to ask about the present moment have already left it 3 times before they finish asking the question. This is not a moral failure. It is a habit. The mind moves quickly because it believes speed is safety. It believes that if it is always ahead of what is happening, nothing will catch it unprepared." He paused. "But the present moment cannot be prepared for. It can only be inhabited." Wei Mingzi was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a pair of thrushes were moving through the maple branches, their small movements catching the morning light. "I have been running my business this way for 12 years, he said at last. I am always 3 steps ahead. And when you are 3 steps ahead, the master said, where is your gratitude? It was a strange question. Wei Mingji thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything with speed and precision. But the question resisted speed. It was like trying to cut water. I don't understand, he said. A man who is always 3 steps ahead, Hui Yuan said slowly, is always standing in a place that does not yet exist. And a man who is standing in a place that does not exist cannot receive what is being given to him right now, cannot taste his tea, cannot feel the warmth of the cup, cannot notice that the maple outside the window is exactly this color this morning and will never be exactly this color again. He paused. Gratitude requires presence. You cannot be grateful for something you are not actually touching. Wei Mingji looked at the cup, then at the maple, then at the steam still rising from the brazier, fine as a thread of silk being pulled through a needle. I have missed a great deal, he said. Yes, Ho Yuan said, but you have also missed the missing. Because the mind that is always ahead is not troubled by what it misses. It is only troubled by what it has not yet achieved. He picked up the teapot and refilled both cups without asking permission. With the ease of someone performing an act so familiar, it has become its own kind of grace. This is the pattern. This is what we come to see. Wei Mingzi stayed at Qingxinxi for 7 days. He had planned to stay 3. What happened in those 7 days was not dramatic. There were no sudden awakenings, no moments of blinding clarity. What happened was more modest and, in its modesty, more transforming than anything dramatic could have been. He was taught to drink tea, not the theory of tea, the actual drinking of it. The weight of the cup, the specific resistance of the liquid against the lip, the way heat travels from the throat downward, a spreading warmth that arrives in the chest like the first word of a sentence you have been waiting to hear. He was taught that just this, the cup and the warmth and the steam and the morning was not a preparation for something more important. It was the thing itself. He watched the monks move through their days, and he began to notice something he had never noticed about human movement before. The monks were not slow. Exactly. They moved with efficiency and purpose. But there was no gap between where they were and what they were doing. The monk carrying water was entirely engaged in carrying water, not planning what came after, not evaluating what had come before. The monk sweeping the courtyard was sweeping with his whole self. The monk serving tea at the afternoon rest period was serving tea with an attention that made the receiving of it feel like a ceremony, even when it was not treated as one. He asked Hui Yuan about this on the 5th day, sitting again in the small tea room that he had come to think of as the only room where he was reliably present. They are not doing anything special, he said. They are simply here. Yes, the master said. And that is the practice. That is the practice. But I have a business, Wei Mingji said. I cannot simply be here. I have to plan. I have to anticipate. I have to be 3 steps ahead or the business fails. Hui Yuan nodded slowly, as if he had heard this exact sentence in different words, from different mouths many hundreds of times. 3 steps ahead is a useful tool, he said at last. What is not useful is living there. You can plan and then return. You can look 3 steps ahead and then come back to this step. He gestured to the space in front of him. This step, the one you are actually standing on. He picked up the teapot. He poured. He held out the cup. "What are you noticing right now?" he asked. Wei Mingji took the cup, felt its weight, felt the warmth, noticed the thin curl of steam, noticed the morning light through the paper screen window, casting its particular soft diffusion over the table. The cups, the old monk's patient hands. "I am noticing," he said slowly, "that I am being given something." "Yes," He Yuan said, "and I have not been noticing that for a long time. No, I have been receiving things all my life," Wei Mingji said quietly, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there when he arrived. Something that might be called the sound of a door opening, and not noticing that they were gifts. "Because I was already holding the next thing, planning the next thing." He stopped. Then, more slowly, "My wife brought me tea every morning for 6 years, and I drank it while reading correspondence." Wu Yuan said nothing. He did not need to. Wei Mingji sat with the cup of tea in his hands for a very long time. Long enough for the light through the window to shift. Long enough for the thrushes in the maple to finish whatever they were doing and leave and be replaced by the thin, clear whistle of a bird he could not name. Long enough for the tea to move from warm to cool, and for him to notice that transition as something worth noticing, as one of the 10,000 small changes that compose a day, unremarkable in themselves and together amounting to an entire irreplaceable life. He left on the 7th day. Before he left, he went to the master's room and bowed very deeply, not the efficient bow of a man performing a courtesy, but the bow of someone who means it, who has spent 7 days learning to mean things again. "I will come back," he said. Hui Yuan looked at him. "You don't need to come back," he said. "You just need to go home." It is a particular kind of suffering, this kind, because it does not feel like suffering. It feels like competence. It feels like intelligence. It feels like the reasonable behavior of a person taking their life seriously, planning carefully, making the most of their time. And while you are feeling all of that, the tea cools in the cup, and the morning light moves across the table, and your wife stands in the doorway looking at the back of your head, and the child says something quietly remarkable, and the maple tree outside reaches its specific, once-in-a-lifetime color, and all of it passes through you like light through an empty room, present for an instant, and then gone. The Chan masters called this the most ordinary of all delusions. Not the grand metaphysical errors, the belief in a permanent self, the grasping at permanence. Just this small daily habit of never quite arriving where you are. And the antidote was not philosophy. It was tea. It was water being poured. It was the weight of a cup in 2 hands, and the heat moving through ceramic into skin. And the precise, unrepeatable smell of this morning's brewing in this particular room, in this particular company. Notice, for a moment, what is happening in your body right now. The weight of it, the specific warmth or coolness of the air on your face, the particular way the darkness feels in the room where you are lying, whether it is total or whether there is a thin line of light somewhere. Under a door, at the edge of a curtain. Notice the sound your breath makes, not the idea of your breath. The actual sound. The particular frequency of this body doing its quiet, faithful work. You are here. Right now. You are here. You don't need to be anywhere else. You don't need to be 3 steps ahead. The planning can wait. The list can wait. For this moment, For these few minutes of this particular night, there is only this, the warmth, the darkness, the breath, the being here. This is the gift that was always in your hands. This present moment, offering itself to you with the patience of a monk pouring tea for a merchant who has not yet learned to receive it. Receive it now. Just this. Just here. Just this warmth, in this darkness, in this quiet. Let your body sink another degree. Let the breath lengthen. Let the mind begin to release its grip on tomorrow, on next week, on everything that is not here. You don't have to go anywhere. You have already arrived. And as you soften into that arriving, as the merchant inside you sets down his correspondence and finally tastes his tea, another story rises to meet us. We move now to the rice terraces and river mist of medieval Vietnam, where a king who had everything learned something unexpected about the relationship between a full life and an empty hand. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. If sleep is beginning to find you, let it come. You don't need to stay awake to receive what is being offered. The river is carrying you. You are already on your way. There is a particular cruelty that only abundance can deliver. It is the cruelty of the person who has everything and cannot feel it, who moves through rooms full of beauty and warmth and the love of others and touches none of it. Because somewhere in the architecture of their mind, the receiving mechanism has broken, or perhaps was never built. They mistake this numbness for wisdom. They mistake the inability to be moved as proof of their strength. And they keep waiting for some future moment, some final arrival, some threshold beyond which they will finally be allowed to feel the fullness of what they have been given. This pattern is old. It runs through every culture and every century. And the teachers who understood it most clearly were not the ones who lived in poverty and found richness in simplicity. The most surprising teachers on this subject were the ones who had every material gift and could not feel them, who sat at the center of extraordinary abundance and experienced it as emptiness, because they had never learned the art of reception. This is the story of one such person. He was real. His name was Chun Yun Tong, and he was the emperor of Dai Viet. He was born in 1258. The eldest son of King Trần Thánh Tông, in the royal palace of Thăng Long, the rising dragon city, the great capital of medieval Vietnam that rose from the banks of the Red River in the north of the country. A city of wide boulevards and wooden palaces painted red and gold, of temple bells ringing across flat water in the early morning, of lotus ponds and the smell of incense that drifted through every courtyard from the shrines that stood in every family's home. From the humblest farmer's hut to the emperor's innermost chamber, he was, by every measure, extraordinarily fortunate. He was born into the most powerful family in the country, in the most prosperous period that country had yet known. He was beautiful as a child. Historical records describe him as having a golden complexion and a quality of presence that made people stop and look. He was educated by the finest scholars in the land. He had access to every text that had made its way from China or India, to music and poetry and martial arts and statecraft. He was loved genuinely, not merely dutifully by his parents, and by the teachers who recognized in him a quality of mind that was finer than his station alone could account for. And from his earliest years, despite all of this, because of all of this, or perhaps entirely unrelated to all of this, there was something in him that would not settle. He had read the Buddhist teachings as a boy, the way all educated children of the Tran dynasty read them as philosophy, as culture, as part of the fabric of what it meant to be Vietnamese. But somewhere between the reading and the understanding, something had lodged in him like a splinter. The texts described a mind that was naturally luminous, naturally peaceful, naturally free, a mind that was, in the terminology of the Vietnamese Thien tradition that was flowering in those years, already the Buddha mind, already complete, already sufficient. And he could not find that mind inside himself. He had everything. He was everything his culture said a person should be. And underneath all of it was an ache of incompleteness he could not explain and could not remedy. He became emperor at 21, when his father abdicated, as was the tradition of the Tran kings. The weight of the throne fell onto him with the certainty and absoluteness of stone. He was responsible for a country of several million people, for their harvests and their wars and their prayers and their disputes. He managed the complex machinery of court politics, where alliances shifted like river mud and enemies wore the faces of friends. He married, had children, governed with genuine skill and genuine care. And then, in 1284, the Mongols came. The army that descended from the north was, by contemporary accounts, among the largest military forces the world had yet assembled. The Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Empire that had already swallowed China, Korea, Persia, and much of the known world, sent 300,000 soldiers into Dai Viet. They came with the absolute confidence of a force that had never been stopped. They came expecting what every other nation had given them: collapse, submission, the prostrating of kings. Tran Nhân Tong did not prostrate. He fought. What followed over the next 3 years, and then again in 1287, when the Mongols returned with an even larger force, was among the most remarkable military achievements in the history of Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese forces, dramatically outnumbered, used the river networks and the dense forests and their intimate knowledge of the land to fight a war of movement and delay that exhausted and confused an enemy accustomed to open field dominance. And at the great naval battle of Bac Dung River, the Vietnamese drove iron-tipped stakes into the riverbed at low tide, lured the Mongol fleet forward as the tide rose, then struck as the tide fell and destroyed the entire enemy fleet in a single afternoon. Twice the greatest military power the world had ever known came to Dai Viet. Twice it was turned back. And Tran Nhân Tong, standing at the center of this achievement, a 30-year-old emperor who had just done what no one in the known world had managed to do, felt something he had not expected. He felt the ache again, unchanged, as though the victories had passed through him like water through stone reel, enormous, genuinely celebrated, and had altered nothing in the place where the ache lived. He had won everything, and the winning had delivered nothing of what he had been hoping the winning would deliver. There was a teacher in those years named Tuệ Trong Tuong Si, the upper master Tuệ Trong, who was a lay practitioner of extraordinary depth, a man of the Tran royal family himself who had refused the highest positions of state in order to practice the Thien way in his home, among his family, in the ordinary circumstances of a life fully lived. He was not a monk. He had a wife and children and a household and servants and land. And he was, by the testimony of every teacher who encountered him, one of the most deeply awakened people in the country. The emperor came to him in the years after the second Mongol defeat, when the immediate business of reconstruction and governance had settled enough to allow for something more personal. He came not as an emperor to a subject, but as a student to a teacher. He arrived at the upper master's house with a few attendants and sat across from him in an ordinary room and said, without preamble, "I have been given everything. I feel almost nothing. Tell me why." Tuetrung did not look surprised. He had, perhaps, been expecting some version of this question for years. "Tell me what you have been given," he said. The emperor began. He spoke of the throne, the armies, the victories, the palace, the family, the country. He spoke of the harvests that had come in well these last years, the roads being rebuilt, the temples restored, the people finding their feet again after the wars. He spoke methodically, precisely, in the way a man trained in statecraft speaks of facts with clarity and without embellishment. Tuetrung listened. When the emperor finished, the teacher said, "You have described what you have acquired. You have not described what you have been given." The emperor was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't understand the difference." "What you have acquired," the teacher said slowly, "came through your effort and your will and your skill. You counted it before you had it. And you count it now that you have it. And the counting never stops. What you have been given requires no accounting. It simply arrived." He paused. "When did your eyes last arrive?" "My eyes? You have been seeing with them since birth. Did you ask for them? Did you plan for them? Did you negotiate for the color of the light they let through to you this morning, the particular quality of the winter sun on the river, which was different this morning from any other morning and will not be that color again?" He looked at the emperor without deference, the look of a teacher who has dispensed with the politics of rank because those politics are irrelevant to this conversation. You received your eyes the way you received the air in your lungs, without asking, without deserving, without any effort whatsoever. And you have been looking through them every day for 30 years, and you have never once noticed them as a gift. The emperor sat with that. Around them, the sounds of a Vietnamese household in late autumn, the distant sound of cooking, a child's voice somewhere, the bark of a dog, the calling of birds moving south through the grey sky above the courtyard. "And the victories?" he asked at last. "Yours," the teacher said. "Entirely yours. Hard-won, fully deserved. The product of extraordinary courage and leadership. No one can take that from you." He paused. "But the soldiers who stood beside you, the generals who slept in the mud of the riverbanks and were not afraid, the fishermen who knew the tides of the Bachdang and told you where to set the stakes, the farmers who fed the army through 2 winters of conflict, the monks who prayed in the mountain temples, the women who hid the wounded and turned away the informers." Another pause, longer this time. "Did you acquire their loyalty? Did you earn it with your own effort alone?" The emperor did not answer. "You were held," Tuetrung said quietly, "by a country, by a people, by 10,000 acts of courage and love and sacrifice that you will never know the names of. You stood at the center of something vast and generous, and you have been so focused on your own role within it that you have not yet stopped to receive the vastness. That was the beginning. What followed over the next years was not a sudden transformation. The emperor was a thorough man. He did not change quickly. But something had shifted in the quality of his attention. The way a river shifts when a new tributary joins it, the volume changed. The direction remained the same for a while. But gradually, the whole character of the water began to be different. He began to notice, not the grand things he had always noticed those, but the smaller ones. The way the lotus in the palace pond opened in the morning, not as a symbol, not as something to be appreciated in the manner an educated man appreciates symbols, but as a fact. This flower, this water, this morning, the specific angle of light across the water that would never come again. The way his eldest daughter laughed at something that startled her. A laugh that was entirely her own, not the laugh she offered at court. The carefully managed expression of a royal child, but the one that escaped when she was surprised. The real one. The one that sounded like water striking stone. He became a student of Tuệ Trung in the full formal sense. And in those years of study, the teaching he returned to most often was not the grand philosophical teachings on the nature of mind or the structure of emptiness or the path of the bodhisattva. It was the simplest one, the one that Tuệ Trung offered on the day of their first meeting and never needed to repeat because it was already complete. You have been held by more than you have ever stopped to count. And the gratitude for that holding is not a feeling you produce. It is a seeing that you allow. In 1299, when he was 41 years old, Tran Nhan Tong abdicated the throne to his son and walked away from the palace in the night, as the records say. Literally walked away. Left at midnight. Left the dragon robe behind. Climbed into the mountains of the northeast and made his way to Mount Yentu, where the ancient forest monasteries clung to the granite ridges above the cloud line. He took the robes of a monk. He took the Dharma name Diu Nguk Jaquang, the taming and protecting enlightened one. And he founded the Truc Lam school, the Bamboo Grove school, which would become the first purely Vietnamese lineage of Zen. The tradition that would carry the Dharma forward through the next 7 centuries of that country's extraordinary, turbulent, magnificent life. He wrote a poem in those years that has survived, living in the world, joyful in the way. Hunger comes, I eat. Tired, I sleep. Treasure is in the house. Stop searching outside. Face your nature directly. This is Buddha. Living in the world. Joyful in the way. Not after the world has been perfected. Not when all the battles are won and all the debts are paid and all the inadequacies have been resolved. In the world, as it is. Now, with eyes that see the lotus opening and the morning light on the water and the laugh that escapes a child when something catches her by surprise. The pattern that had kept Tran Nhan Tong from his own life for 30 years is not an unusual one. It is, in fact, nearly universal. The mind that acquires and counts and measures and plans is a powerful and necessary thing. But it has a tendency, unless interrupted, to colonize the entire territory of a life. To insist that every experience must first pass through its accounting before it can be received. And what that means, in practice, is that almost nothing is ever truly received. It passes through the accounting and is assigned its value and moved to the ledger of things possessed. And then the accounting begins again, looking for the next thing. This is not gratitude. This is inventory. Gratitude is what happens when you stop the inventory long enough to actually touch what is here. When you let the morning light be morning light rather than the setting for your plans. When you let the warmth of the blanket be warmth rather than a condition to be maintained. When you let the simple fact of breathing this breath, right now, which arrived without your asking and asks nothing in return, be the gift that it actually is. The emperor monk walked away from the greatest military victories of his age and found, on a mountain in the northeast of Vietnam, something that all the victories had pointed toward and none of them had delivered. Not because the victories were wrong, not because the palace was a mistake, but because no external achievement has ever, in the entire history of human beings on this earth, taught a person to receive. That is a different practice entirely. That is the practice that happens in the body, in the present, in the small, unremarkable moments that compose the actual substance of a life. Notice your body right now, the specific way it rests against whatever holds it, the warmth in the places where warmth has gathered, the particular quality of this night's darkness, which is different from last night's and will be different from tomorrow's. You are inside a gift. You have always been inside a gift. The receiving is the practice. Just this. The breath, the warmth, the being here. Just this. Enough. Already. Entirely. Enough. Let your shoulders fall. Let the breath deepen on its own. Feel the weight of your body releasing, degree by degree, into what holds you: the bed, the earth, the night, the long patience of the world that has been holding you since the very first breath and has not once let you fall. You were given that too. That holding, that patient, wordless, unearned, unrepeatable gift. Receive it now. And as that receiving deepens in you, as the king inside you sets down his victories and simply rests, another story rises to find us. We travel west and north through the centuries, into the high, cold mountains of Tibet, where a woman who had lost everything discovered that loss itself can be a doorway into a gratitude more radical than any abundance had ever given her. If sleep is finding you now, let it come. You don't need to hold on. The river knows the way. Snow had been falling on the eastern plateau for 3 days, without pause, when Droma finally walked to the river. She had been thinking about it for 4 weeks, since the old Lama Karma Wangchuk had sat across from her in the dim kitchen of her stone house, drinking butter tea with the unhurried patience of a man who had all the time in the world, and had told her that the thing she feared most was the very thing she needed to walk toward. She had thought about it while grinding barley. She had thought about it while mending the prayer flags that had frayed in the autumn wind. She had thought about it in the long hours before dawn, when sleep would not come and the silence of the village was so complete she could hear the yaks breathing in the stable below the floor. And now it was winter. The plateau locked under white, the mountains above the village showing only their lowest ridges through the cloud. And she pulled her chuba, the heavy sheepskin coat that had been her husband's before hers, tighter across her chest, and walked the half-mile down the frozen path to the place where Gyatso had gone through the ice. This is a story about Tibetan Buddhism's most radical understanding of gratitude. Not the warm, comfortable kind, the kind that comes from the other side of the river. Droma was 38 years old. She had been born and grown up and married and grown older in this small village on the eastern rim of the Tibetan plateau, in the region called Kham, where the mountains were of a scale that made the word mountain seem inadequate. They were more like a second world, stacked above the first, inhabited by wind and snow leopard, and the particular quality of silence that only exists above a certain altitude. The village itself was a cluster of stone houses around a central courtyard where a prayer wheel turned in all weathers, painted in faded blues and reds, inscribed with the mantra that the wind carried out in all directions into the valley below. She had been happy here. That was the thing she kept returning to. The fact that surprised her most when she examined it honestly. She had been genuinely, specifically, unself-consciously happy, not because her life was without difficulty, but because she had never needed it to be otherwise. The cold winters and the hard work and the intermittent hardships of a farming life on the high plateau had never seemed like obstacles to her contentment. They had simply been the texture of a life she loved. A life whose center was Gyatso, his large, weathered hands, his economy of movement, his way of being in a room that made the room feel entirely sufficient. He had died in the 3rd month of the previous year, crossing a river that had always been solid in that season, but was not solid that year. He went through quickly. She had been told it was quick, and she had chosen to believe this because the alternative was not bearable. The months since had been the strangest of her life. Not because they were filled with dramatic suffering, she was not a dramatic person, but because they were filled with a quality of numbness she had never encountered before and did not have words for in her language. She continued doing everything she had always done. The cooking, the prayers, the work, the tending of the animals, the small social exchanges of a village where everyone knew everyone, and grief was understood as a collective as much as a personal condition. She did all of it. She did it well, even, and none of it touched her anywhere she could feel. The practice was the hardest part. Droma had been a practitioner since childhood. Her grandmother had brought her to the monastery from the time she could walk, and the prayers and the visualization practices and the prostrations and the mandala offerings were as embedded in her daily life as breathing so familiar they required almost no thought, which meant that when the inner life they were connected to went quiet, she continued performing the forms without noticing for some time that the forms had become hollow. Empty gestures made by a person who had sealed herself off from her own experience so efficiently that even the practices designed to open the heart could not find a way in. She told Karma Wangchuk this when he visited in the autumn. She told him the practice felt like speaking into a room where no one was present. She told him she was afraid that the grief had damaged her permanently, had broken the mechanism by which feeling reached her, so that she was now moving through her life from the outside of it, competent, correct, and entirely absent. The old Lama listened with the complete attention that was his most remarkable quality, not a performed attentiveness, but genuine presence. The kind that makes a person feel that what they are saying is being heard all the way down to its root, not just its surface. When she finished, he did not immediately respond. He drank his tea. He looked at the window, where the last afternoon light was turning the rim of the mountains amber. Then he said, "You described the management of grief very accurately, but you have not described the grief itself. What does it actually feel like when you let it be there without managing it?" She started to answer. She opened her mouth, and nothing came. "That is the answer," he said quietly. "You don't know, because you have not yet let it be there." He told her then about the practice called Chud, the ancient Tibetan teaching of cutting through, developed in the 11th century by a great yogini who had understood that the path to genuine opening runs not around what we fear, but directly through it. The practice instructed students to go toward the scary places, to sit in the centers of their fear rather than constructing increasingly elaborate structures to avoid them, to discover, through direct experience rather than philosophical reasoning, what was actually on the other side of the thing they were running from. He did not tell Droma to go to a charnel ground. He told her to go to the river. She did not go that week. She was not ready. She went back to the barley grinding and the prayer flags and the long hours before dawn and the hollow practice and the efficient management of a grief she had not yet agreed to feel. She went back to the life she had built around the absence, which was a competent and organized life, tidy as a well-kept house, and about as alive as one. But the Lama's words stayed, the way certain words do, not as an idea in the mind, but as something heavier, something with physical presence, sitting somewhere below the sternum and refusing to be ignored. What does it actually feel like when you let it be there? She did not know. And not knowing was, she began to understand, its own kind of suffering. On a morning in the first week of the winter snowfall, before the village was awake, she dressed in Gyatso's chuba and walked the half-mile down to the river. The river ran between stone banks under a thin skin of shore ice at the edges. The center was open, dark water moving quickly over smooth stones, making the continuous sound of something speaking in too many voices to hear any single word. The willows that lined the bank were bare, their long fingers trailing in the current, dusted with snow along their upper surfaces where the night's fall had settled. She stood at the bank. Her heart was immediately, absolutely loud. Louder than she had known. It could be louder than she had felt anything in the year since his death, which told her something significant about what management costs. She felt her legs wanting to take her back up the path. She felt the familiar impulse to reframe, to find the philosophical position from which this moment could be observed at a safe distance. She had become very skilled at finding that position. She was always somewhere just slightly above and behind her own experience, watching it from sufficient remove that it could not reach her fully. She stayed at the bank. She breathed. She did what Karma Wangchuk had told her to do. She let the fear be the size it actually was. It was very large. It moved through her the way the river moved, not in one wave but in a continuous current, one thing after another flowing through the same channel. The terror of that specific day, the image of the ice and the cold and the speed with which the river works, the year of hollow mornings, the prayer wheel turning without her, the yaks coming down the trail without anyone to go up and check on them in the early hours, the specific quality of the silence on the other side of his breathing in the night, a silence that was different from any silence she had known, a silence with a shape in it, a negative space that was precisely the dimensions of one particular man. She wept. She wept in the way that she had been preventing herself from weeping for a year without management, without the practice containment that keeps grief acceptable and presentable and survivable at a reasonable cost to the rest of the inner life. She wept until her breath was ragged and the snow on the bank around her was spotted dark with tears, and she had no more capacity left for any further thought of any kind. And then there was silence, a different silence from the one she had been living inside for a year. Not the managed, hollow silence of someone keeping very careful control. A silence that had been earned by passing through something. The way the air after a storm is different from the air before it, the same air, different in every quality that matters. She stood in that silence, and into it slowly, tentatively. The way light enters a room when someone opens a shutter, only a crack, something entirely unexpected arrived. Gratitude, not for his death. She was clear about this, and the teaching did not ask otherwise. Not gratitude for the loss, or for the hardship, or for the year of hollow practice, or for any of the suffering that had come since that afternoon in the third month. But gratitude for the 16 years. For every specific morning of those 16 years, the ones she could name, and the vast majority she could not. The 10,000 ordinary mornings that had composed the substance of a life she had not known how to value until it was gone. The gratitude arrived at full strength because she was finally feeling the loss at full strength. They were the same size. They had always been the same size because they rose from the same root. The love that had made the 16 years precious was the same love that made the loss devastating. The gratitude and the grief were not two separate things happening in sequence. They were one thing, one recognition, expressed in two directions. The grief saying this mattered and it is gone. The gratitude saying this mattered and it was here. She had been trying to manage the grief without understanding that by doing so she was managing the love as well. She had been keeping herself small enough to survive, and smallness was the cost. She stood at the river for a long time, long enough for the morning light to move through its full early arc, touching the mountains above the village and turning the peaks from grey to that particular colour that existed between rose and gold, and which she had always loved and had not let herself love for a year. Long enough for two ravens to land in the willows above her and then depart. Long enough for the cold to reach through the tuba in the way it does when you stop moving and become part of the landscape. And she did not feel the need to leave. She returned to the river many times that winter. Not always with the full weight of grief, sometimes with simply the willingness to be there, to be at the place she had feared and to discover, through repeated direct experience rather than argument or philosophy, that being there did not destroy her. That the river continued being a river regardless of what the river had taken. That the willows continued and the ravens continued and the mountains continued and she continued. And continuance was actually quite a remarkable thing when you stopped taking it for granted. Karma Wangchuk came in the spring. He found her in the courtyard mending harness leather in the early morning light. With the quality of attention she brought now to most things, not a forced mindfulness, but the natural attention of a person who has learned, through one specific hard lesson, that ordinary moments are not ordinary. He sat across from her on an upturned wooden bucket and did not say anything for a while. He watched the mountains. She worked. You went, he said, finally. Many times, she said. And what did you find? She set the leather down. She looked at her hands, the hands that had been Gyatso's hand's companion for 16 years. The hands that had touched his face on the last morning before the river. The hands she lived inside every day and had never once thought to be grateful for. I found, she said slowly, that I had been trying to protect myself from the grief by not feeling the love. I thought they were separate, that I could keep the grief small and the love could stay somewhere safe. But they are the same thing. They use the same door. Karma Wangchuk nodded. Unhurried. The nod of a person who has been waiting for someone to arrive at something the someone needed to arrive at in their own time. And now? He asked. Now, she said, the mornings are different. Not easier, but different. I notice more. The light on the mountains. The weight of this. She touched the leather harness. The sound of the prayer wheel. I don't know if this is what gratitude is supposed to feel like, but it feels true. It feels like something I am actually inside of, rather than something I am observing from a safe distance. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the spring sounds of the village, a child's voice somewhere, the distant movement of yaks, the prayer wheel turning. Real gratitude, he said at last, is never pretty. Not the kind that comes from the bottom of things. It does not arrive like a gift on a clean table. It arrives covered in river water. It arrives up to the weeping. It arrives when you have finally agreed to let something be as large as it actually is, and you discover that you are still standing, and the mountains are still there, and the day is still making its quiet, faithful progress from dark to light. He paused. That is not the gratitude of comfort. That is the gratitude of someone who has been all the way through. The practice that Ma Chig Labdron developed in 11th century Tibet, the fierce and compassionate practice of Chud. The cutting through was built on a single recognition that we suffer most not from what we encounter but from what we avoid. The charnel grounds she sent her students to were not literal requirements. They were instructions about the quality of courage needed. Go toward what frightens you. Sit in the center of your fear. Discover through direct experience, not through argument or reassurance, what is actually there. What is actually there, on the other side of the things we most fear feeling, is almost always more survivable than the management of the fear. The grief is survivable. The love is survivable. The loss is survivable. And on the other side of letting them be fully what they are, full-sized, uncondensed, unmanaged, there is something the Tibetan teachers called genuine tenderness. An open-heartedness earned not by avoiding difficulty, but by agreeing to be fully present inside it. This is not a gratitude you can think your way into. It is not available from the safe, observing distance above and behind your own experience. It arrives only when you descend from that distance and agree to stand on the actual ground of your actual life at the bank of the actual river, in the actual cold, with the actual weight of love and loss present at their actual size. And when it arrives, it changes the quality of everything it touches. Not by removing the pain, not by making the loss acceptable or the grief small, but by widening the heart enough to hold the pain and the beauty simultaneously, the grief and the morning light, the absence and the river still running. The love that remains, because love does not go through the ice with the beloved. Love stays. It changes form, but it stays. Let the breath soften now, moving in and out without effort. Feel the weight of your body resting exactly where it is held by whatever holds you. The bed, the floor, the deep, patient ground beneath everything. If there is something you have been keeping at a managed distance tonight, some feeling or memory or weight you have been holding carefully at arm's length, you do not need to open the door fully right now. But notice that the door is there. Notice that management has a cost. And notice that on the other side of the door, the mountains are still standing. You are still standing. Let that be enough for now. Let the breath carry you. Let the body grow heavy and warm in the darkness. And as Droma's river recedes into the distance behind us, as the plateau fades into the long night of old Tibet, another story lifts us forward. We cross the sea eastward into the mountain monasteries of medieval Japan, where a Soto Zen master was teaching his students something astonishing about the bowl of rice that arrived in front of them every single morning without fail. If sleep is close, let it come. You need not hold on. The river knows the way home. Before the monks rose for Zazen, before the bell rang its single note through the cold mountain air of Echigo province, before the first pale grey of morning had decided whether it would become dawn or simply remain as the sky's uncertainty, the Tenzo was already awake. This was always so. In the Soto Zen monastery of Aiheiji, in the mountains of what is now Fukui Prefecture, the head cook rose before everyone. He rose while the darkness was still absolute, while the cedar trees outside the kitchen wall were still invisible against the sky, and he began the work that would feed 60 monks their first meal of the day before the sun had fully committed to rising. The kitchen was his zendo. The wooden ladle was his kesa robe. The fire he coaxed to life in the stone hearth in the last hours of night was, if he understood his practice correctly, the same fire as the one that burned in the meditation hall, not metaphorically, not as a teaching device, but actually, in the same way the Dharma was actually the food, and the food was actually the Dharma. Master Dogen had said this plainly, and the best Tenzo were the ones who had stopped wondering whether he meant it and simply agreed to proceed as if it were true. The Tenzo, whose story this is, a story inspired by the deep tradition of Soto Zen monastic life in 13th century Japan, was a monk named Ryokan. Not the great poet Ryokan, who would come 3 centuries later, though this Ryokan shared something of his sensibility. This Ryokan was 44 years old, had been at Echigo for 19 years, and had held the position of Tenzo for the last 6. He was a man of medium height with very precise hands, the hands of someone who has spent 2 decades perfecting the economy of monastic movement, and with the particular kind of face that comes from years of rising before dawn and encountering the cold with equanimity. A face that had been weathered not into hardness, but into something else, a kind of careful attentiveness, as though the world were always offering him something he did not want to miss. He was not, by his own assessment, a man of great spiritual accomplishment. He had sat zazen 10,000 times. He had chanted the sutras so often the words lived in his body rather than his mind, rising without his having to search for them, the way breath rises. He had worked in this kitchen for 6 years, and before that, in the gardens, and before that, in the building of the new meditation hall, where his back still remembered the weight of the stones. He had not had any particular awakening that he could point to. No moment of sudden seeing. No transmission letter or ceremony marking him as something other than an ordinary monk doing ordinary work in an ordinary mountain monastery in the middle of his middle-aged life. What he had instead was a practice that had been deepening, imperceptibly and without drama, the way a river deepens a channel through stone, not through any single flood, but through the faithful return of water. Year after year, wearing the stone by sheer persistence. And what that practice had been deepening, in this 6th year, as Tenzo in particular, was his relationship to a single grain of rice. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Every morning Ryokan measured the rice for the community's breakfast gruel. He measured it with the same cedar wood cup he had used for 6 years, filling it to precisely the marked line, repeating the measurement for the entire community. 60 portions, 60 monk mornings that began with this bowl and this grain and this particular labor of preparation. He had done this calculation several thousand times, and for most of those thousands of times, it had been exactly what it appeared to be: a measurement, a task, an item to complete before moving to the next item, which was the water for the pot, which was followed by the fire under the pot, which was followed by the watching and the stirring and the timing that was the technical substance of his work. He was competent at all of it. The monks ate well, the abbot expressed, in the restrained Soto way, a consistent appreciation for the quality of the kitchen's output. Ryokan did not think about any of this particularly. He did the work the way a person does any work they have done for a long time and have made their own automatically, efficiently, and with a fraction of the attention the work had required when it was new. It was the abbot who interrupted this pattern. Not dramatically. The abbot at that time was a man named Gikai, a senior monk whose teaching style was characterized by a preference for the indirect and the patient. He rarely corrected a monk's understanding directly, preferring instead to create the conditions in which the monk might arrive at the correction himself. which he felt was the only kind of understanding that stuck. He came to the kitchen one morning in the 4th month of Ryokan's 6th year and stood at the entrance for some time, watching the Tenzo work. Ryokan was aware of his presence, but did not stop or turn. Interrupting the kitchen work for anything short of a fire was not the practice, and the abbot knew this. When the gruel was done and the monks had eaten and the kitchen had been cleaned with the meticulous care that Dogen's instructions prescribed, no single drop of rice water poured on the floor, no grain left in the pot from want of attention. The bowls cleaned with the wiping cloth in the prescribed sequence and wrapped back in their carrying cloth with the top knot that resembled a lotus blossom. Only then did Ryokan come to where the abbot was sitting in the small courtyard outside the kitchen building, drinking his tea. Gikai looked up. He said, "Who grew the rice?" Ryokan considered the question briefly. It did not seem like the kind of question that needed particular thought. "The farmers in the valley," he said. "The donors who purchased it bring it up on the 1st and 15th of each month." "And before the farmers," the abbot said. "Who grew it?" Ryokan was quiet. This was a different kind of question. He understood that much immediately, not a request for information, but an invitation into a particular kind of looking. "The rain," he said slowly. "The soil. The sun. And before those..." Ryokan sat down across from the abbot without being invited. This was slightly irregular. The abbot did not comment on it. "The causes and conditions that produce the rain," Ryokan said. "And the causes and conditions that produce those conditions." And so on. Backward into, he stopped. Into something without a beginning I can locate. Gikai drank his tea. "Every morning," he said, "you measure 60 portions of rice. You have done this for 6 years. You have held that cedar cup in your hand several thousand times." He paused. "When was the last time you noticed what you were holding?" The question sat in the courtyard between them like an object with physical weight. Around them, the sounds of the monastery moving through its morning, the brush of brooms on the stone walkways, the distant bell marking the end of the first work period, the sound of the kitchen fire settling. "I notice the measurement," Ryokan said carefully. "I notice whether the cup is full to the line." "Yes," the abbot said. "You notice the measurement. You do not notice the rice." This distinction might seem fine enough to step through without noticing the step. Ryokan sat with it the way the Soto school had taught him to sit with everything, not trying to resolve it quickly, not forcing it toward a conclusion, but remaining present in the space of not yet knowing with the same quality of attention he brought to Zazen. Facing the wall, open, letting whatever rose, rise. What rose, in the days and weeks that followed, was not a sudden insight, but a gradual reorientation of his attention, the way a person reorients to a room when the light source changes from one direction to another. The room is the same. The objects in it are identical. But everything looks different, because the light is different, and therefore the shadows fall in different places and reveal different surfaces. He began to look at the rice, not at its measurement, not at its adequacy for 60 portions. At the rice itself, the individual grains, each one a small, pale, a specific object that had once been attached to a living plant in a wet field somewhere in the valley below the mountain, that had been grown from a seed, that had been grown from a rice plant that stretched backward through 10,000 generations of cultivation by 10,000 pairs of hands. Each pair attached to a person who had lived and died and been given back to the soil that grew the rice. and so on, in a chain of interdependence so vast and so dense that Ryokan, standing at the kitchen bench in the hour before dawn, holding the cedar cup, found himself stopped, simply stopped, not by awe in any dramatic sense, by something quieter than awe, by the plain recognition of what was in his hand, what had always been in his hand, what he had been holding, unseeing, for 6 years. He held the cup longer than usual. He felt the texture of the grain against the inside of his palm, the slight roughness of each individual hull, the specific dry coolness of the uncooked rice before the water and the fire and the labor transformed it into the nourishment that would carry 60 monks through their morning practice. He noticed, for the first time in 6 years, the sound the rice made when he poured it from the cup into the measuring vessel, a sound like soft rain, which was fitting, since the rain was one of the things that had made this possible. He did not stop measuring. He did not chant special prayers or perform any additional ceremony. He simply began to notice. Every morning, in the hour before the bell, before the sky had committed to dawn, he held the rice in the cedar cup, and for a few seconds he was fully present to what he was holding. Not the measurement. The gift of the farmers who had grown it. The gift of the rain and the soil and the 10,000 years of agricultural knowledge that had selected and refined the variety of rice that grew in these particular valleys. The gift of the donors who carried it up the mountain path twice a month regardless of weather, in baskets strapped to their backs, because they believed the practice happening in this monastery was worth sustaining. The gift of the kitchen itself, the building that had been built by monks, the fire that had been laid, the tools that had been crafted by someone's hands, whose name he would never know. The gift of being alive in a body that could hold a cedar cup and feel the grain against his palm and know the difference between holding something and receiving it. This is the teaching that Dogen Zenji preserved in his Instructions to the Cook, not a technique for achieving enlightenment, but an invitation to inhabit the full significance of what is already here. He wrote that the ancient Zen masters who held the position of Tenzo regarded it as the most sacred responsibility in the monastery, more demanding than the meditation hall itself, because it required a continuous quality of awakeness that no bell could call into being and no form could contain. The Tenzo must be someone who has dissolved the boundary between sacred and ordinary, who understands at the level of the hands and the fire and the grain that there is no such boundary, that the Dharma is the food and the food is the Dharma, and the gratitude that arises from that understanding is not a feeling produced by thinking, it is a natural consequence of actually seeing. The monks who came to eat their morning gruel in the 7th year of Ryokan's tenure as Tenzo sometimes remarked that the food tasted different, not in any ingredient or preparation that they could identify. Something less definable, a quality in it, something that arrived with the bowl and settled into the body with the warmth of the gruel and remained through the morning sitting, through the work period, through the long middle hours of the monastic day. A senior monk mentioned this to the abbot. Gikai considered it for a moment. Then he said, he learned to be in the kitchen. The senior monk was not entirely sure what this meant. He went back to his meditation. The teaching lives in this. We spend enormous energy thinking about gratitude, to what it means, whether we feel it, how to cultivate it, what blocks it. The Soto Zen masters had a simpler approach. They taught their students to hold a bowl of rice, to hold it correctly, to feel the weight and the temperature and the texture, to know, not theoretically, but in the hands and the skin and the bones where it had come from and how many unnamed lives had made it possible. Gratitude, understood this way, is not a feeling you produce. It is a natural consequence of actually looking at what is in your hands. The problem is not that we are ungrateful. The problem is that we are not looking. We are measuring instead of receiving. We are processing instead of touching. We are moving through the cedar cup to the pot, to the fire, to the next task. And the rice passes through our hands without touching us. Because we have learned to be so efficient that the world can no longer reach us. The invitation, the same one Gikai extended to ryokan in a monastery courtyard in 13th century Japan, is to slow down enough to actually touch what you are holding. Not everything. Not all day. Just this one thing. This bowl. This grain. This morning. This breath right now, which is arriving in your lungs from the same vast network of cause and condition that grew the rice. The same air moved by the same winds that carried the same rain to the same fields that fed the same hands that carried the same food up the mountain path to the same kitchen where the same Tenzo stood in the same darkness before the same dawn. Feel the weight of your body right now. The specific warmth where the blanket meets skin, the coolness of the air on your face, the particular quality of this night's silence, which is different from any other silence you have ever been inside. You are being held right now, by more causes and conditions than you could count in a lifetime, by more unnamed hands than any history can record, by the same vast, intricate, patient web of interdependence that made the rice possible, that made the monastery possible, that made this evening possible, this evening, and your presence inside it, and the simple fact that you are breathing. Notice that, just for a moment, feel what is in your hands. That noticing that single brief, honest, unperformed moment of actually receiving what is already here is all the gratitude the teachers were ever pointing toward. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more distant. It is here. Always. It has always been here, just waiting for us to stop measuring and begin to receive. Let the breath fall a little deeper. Let the eyelids rest where they want to rest. Let the body become heavier in the best possible way, the heaviness of something that has finally stopped holding itself up. And as the monastery kitchen fades into the pre-dawn silence of medieval Japan, as the Tenzo's fire settles into embers, another story lifts us forward across the sea of centuries. We travel now into the bamboo groves of ancient India, where the Buddha himself encountered a farmer who was so angry at being given advice by a wandering monk that he said something that changed both their lives forever. If sleep has found you, let it keep you. The stories continue. You don't need to stay awake for them to do their work. "500 ploughs were moving through the red earth of Magadha when the wandering monk appeared at the edge of the field. It was early morning, the wet season just beginning, the air still carrying the smell of last night's rain mixed with the dark mineral scent of turned soil. The workers all men, lean and brown from the season's labor. Their dhotis tucked up above their knees, moved in long parallel lines across the field, each one guiding a wooden plough pulled by a pair of bullocks whose massive shoulders rolled and strained with each step forward through the heavy ground. The field was vast. The voice of 500 ploughs, a single continuous sound that filled the valley the way the river filled it in, flood season total, encompassing, leaving no silence anywhere. Kasibharadvaja stood at the edge of his field, overseeing the distribution of the morning meal to his workers. He was a Brahmin of considerable standing in the region of Ekanala, a landowner whose holdings stretched across several valleys in the southern hills of Magadha. A man who had built his prosperity through the direct and familiar means of work, of planning seasons and managing labor and knowing the soil. Of rising early and sleeping late and doing the particular kind of thinking that keeps 500 workers fed and productive through the long months of the cultivation cycle. He was not a philosophical man. He was a practical one. He understood the world through the evidence of his hands and his ledgers, and what he understood of it had served him very well. He saw the monk standing at the boundary of the field and felt, immediately and without ambiguity, the particular irritation that a busy man feels when someone arrives in his workspace who has clearly never done a day's work in his life. The monk was tall, thin in the way of people who eat simply, wearing the plain saffron robe of the wandering ascetics. He held a begging bowl in both hands. He stood with the stillness of someone who had learned to be comfortable waiting, not the stillness of a man suppressing impatience, but actual, genuine ease in the act of simply being where he was. This stillness irritated Kasibharadvaya more than any amount of fidgeting would have. He walked over to the monk with the purposeful stride of someone who has many things to do and would like to get this interruption completed efficiently. "I plow," he said, without preamble. "I sow. Having plowed and having sown, I eat what I have grown by my own labor. You." He gestured at the monk with the frank directness of a man who believes in speaking plainly. "You should plow and sow as well. Having plowed and sown, you should eat. Not before." It was not the most hospitable greeting ever offered to a wandering teacher. But Kasibharadvaya was not a man who confused politeness with honesty. And he was genuinely irritated, not just at this particular monk, but at the entire category of wandering ascetics who, in his view, moved through the countryside, consuming the labor of people who actually worked while contributing nothing but the occasional philosophical observation, which was, to his mind, a very poor rate of exchange. The monk looked at him without offense, without any visible response to the criticism at all, not with the blank expression of someone suppressing a reaction, but with the quality of a person for whom being challenged is simply another experience among the countless experiences of a day, carrying no more particular weight than the smell of the rain on the soil or the sound of the plows moving through the field behind him. "I plow as well, Brahman," the monk said. "I sow. And having plowed and sown, I eat." This was an unexpected answer. Kasibharadvaya had expected either defensiveness or the kind of elaborate philosophical explanation that he had learned to associate with men of the wandering class. Long words arranged carefully to obscure the simple fact that they were not doing anything useful. He had not expected this direct, unadorned claim of equivalence. He looked the monk over again. He saw no plow, no yoke, no oxen. He saw a thin man in a saffron robe holding a begging bowl with the quiet confidence of someone who has just said something perfectly true. "I don't see your plow," Kasibharadvaya said. "I don't see your yoke, your oxen, your plowshare, your goad. You claim to plow and sow. Where is any of it?" What the monk said next was this, and it has been preserved in the Pali texts of the ancient Buddhist Canon for 25 centuries. Spoken first in the wet morning air of a Magadhan field to a skeptical farmer who had not asked for wisdom and was only slightly interested in receiving it. Faith is the seed. Practice is the rain. Wisdom is my yoke and plow. Modesty is the pole. Mind the strap. mindfulness, my plowshare and goad. Controlled in body and speech, abstemious in food. Truth is my weed cutter. Gentleness, my deliverance. This is the ploughing I plough, which bears the fruit of deathlessness. Having ploughed this ploughing, one is freed from every ill. Kasibharadvaya stood in the morning at the edge of his 500 plough field and listened to these words. He was not a man who cried easily. He was not a man who moved quickly toward unfamiliar territory. He had built his life on the bedrock of the known and the measurable and the verifiable, and everything that life had taught him confirmed that this bedrock was reliable. But something in what the monk said reached him in a place that no reasonable argument could reach, because it was not addressed to the reasoning mind. It was addressed to something underneath the reasoning mind, to the part of Kasibharadvaya that had sometimes, late in the season, when the harvest was coming in, and the work was temporarily complete, and the light on the fields in the late afternoon was more beautiful than any light had a right to be, felt something he could not account for in his ledgers. Something that was not satisfaction with a good harvest, and was not pride in his management, and was not the pleasure of a completed task. Something that did not have a name in the vocabulary he used for everything else. That something heard the monk's words and went very still. The name of the monk was Gautama, and he was the Buddha, the one the ancient texts call the Blessed One, the Tathagata, the fully and completely awakened teacher who had been walking the roads of Magadha and the surrounding regions for many years, meeting the full spectrum of humanity from kings to farmers to prostitutes to outcasts, and finding in each encounter the particular form of the teaching that would reach that particular person in that particular moment. He had come to this field this morning because he had seen, in the way the texts describe as the survey of the world that the awakened mind performs each dawn, the particular ripeness of Kasibharadvaja's understanding. Not that the farmer was ready to become a monk, not that he was already a seeker in any conscious sense, not that he had been looking for the Dharma, simply that his quality of attention, the particular texture of his engagement with the world, was at a point where the right words might land in the right way and open something that had been waiting to open for a very long time. This is the teaching the story carries for us, beneath the obvious beauty of the ploughing verse, that we are often encountered by wisdom before we are seeking it. That the Dharma does not wait for us to arrive at the right question. That the Buddha was standing at the edge of Kasibharadvaja's field before the farmer knew he needed anyone to be standing there. But let us stay with the farmer. Let us follow him through the rest of that morning and the days that followed. Because what happened to Kasibharadvaya after the monk spoke, his verse is the heart of this story, and it concerns gratitude in the most radical sense the word can carry. The farmer's first response, after the long silence in which the words settled into him, was practical. He filled a large bronze bowl with the best of the food that had been prepared for his workers' rich milk rice, the kind reserved for honored guests and important occasions, and he brought it to the monk. "Please eat," he said. "You are indeed a farmer. The ploughing you plough bears the fruit of deathlessness." The monk, the Buddha, looked at the bowl. And then he said something that surprised Kasibharadvaja as much as the verse had surprised him, in a completely different way. He said he could not eat it, not because he was not hungry, not because the food was unsuitable, but because the food had been offered in response to the teaching given as payment for the words and the tradition of those who walk this path. He explained, is that the teaching is not offered in exchange for anything. The Dharma is not merchandise. What is given freely cannot be received in payment. He told the farmer to throw the rice into water where no living things would be disturbed by it. Kasibharadvaya did this. He threw the rice into the water of a clear stream, and the rice touched the cold water and steamed and sizzled in the way that a plough does when you take it from a summer's work and plunge it into the cooling stream. A sound so ordinary and so unexpected in this context that it startled the farmer entirely, and he felt his hair stand on end with something that was not fear but was adjacent to it. The sound of the sacred touching the ordinary, the sound of something much larger than he had been living inside of, suddenly becoming briefly visible. He fell to his knees. This was not a planned or considered response. His body went down before his mind had any opinion about it. He said, "Teach me." The tradition records that Kasibharadvaya, the proud and skeptical and hard-working Brahmin farmer of Ekanala in Magadha, eventually renounced his 500 ploughs and his land and his ledgers and his long-accumulated expertise in the management of the known world, and went forth into the homeless life, and practiced the teaching with the same thoroughness and dedication he had once applied to the management of a large agricultural operation. And not long after his ordination, practicing alone and diligent and resolute in the forest, he attained arahantship, the complete liberation from suffering that the tradition describes as the full fruit of the practice. The ancient texts record this without drama. It is presented simply, the way the texts present most things, one event following another, in the plain language of a tradition that trusts the facts to carry their own weight without decoration. But let us sit for a moment with what actually changed in that field. Let us consider what Kasibharadvaja received in that morning encounter that he had not had before, and that the 500 ploughs and the well-managed fields and the considerable prosperity of his working life had never managed to give him. He received a different kind of sight, not a mystical vision, not an ecstatic experience, simply the recognition sudden, complete, irreversible, that the world was larger than the world he had been living in, that there was a form of ploughing that his eyes, accustomed to the evidence of the visible world, had not been able to see, that a man could walk the roads without a plough or an ox or a yoke or a field and still be farming the most important field of all, the field that produces not grain but the qualities of mind that allow a human being to live and die without being destroyed by either. And this recognition carried with it, for Kasibharadvaja, something he had not expected, gratitude. Not for anything the monk had given him, the teaching had been offered freely, had required no payment, had been brought to him before he even knew he needed it. The gratitude was for something more fundamental. It was the gratitude of a man who has been living in a small room all his life and has just discovered that the walls are not walls, but curtains, and that beyond them in every direction the world extends further than he can see. The gratitude was for the discovery that the world was larger than he had thought, for the discovery that his own life was larger than he had been allowing it to be, for the discovery standing in his own field, on an ordinary wet morning of the planting season, with the sound of 500 ploughs filling the valley, that faith can be a seed, that practice can be the rain, that a man might have been ploughing the most important field in the world for years without knowing it, simply by showing up with honesty and attention and the willingness to work. This is what the teachers of the Theravada tradition have preserved in the Kasibharadvaya Sutta across 25 centuries. Not a lesson about the superiority of the spiritual life over the practical one, not a teaching that tells farmers to abandon their fields, but the recognition that every life, met with the right quality of attention, reveals itself to be much larger than its surface suggests. That the field you are already standing in may be the field you have been looking for all along. That faith and practice and wisdom and mindfulness are not the exclusive property of monks in saffron robes, They are the universal tools of anyone who is willing to plow the inner field with the same seriousness they bring to the outer one. And when that recognition arrives, when the curtains are briefly parted and the room reveals itself to be as large as the sky, the response that rises naturally, without effort, without cultivation, is gratitude for the largeness, for the discovery, for the monk who came to the edge of the field before you knew you needed anyone to be there, for the wet morning air and the sound of the rain on the soil and the 500 plows making their single continuous sound in the valley, all of which were part of the same field, the same Dharma, the same endlessly self-offering world. Let your awareness rest now in that largeness. Notice how this moment, this dark room, this weight of the body, this breath moving in and out without effort is not actually a small thing. It is not the waiting room for the larger life. It is the larger life. Already, completely, exactly here. The questions that felt so urgent earlier today, the evaluations of yourself and your progress and your adequacy, the accounting of what you have achieved and what remains undone. Notice how much smaller those feel from this vantage. Not because they are unimportant, they may be genuinely important, but because they are not all there is. The sky is much bigger than any single cloud moving across it. You are the sky right now, not the cloud. Let your body grow heavier. Let the breath lengthen on its own. Feel the particular quality of this night, this one, not a remembered one or an imagined one. This specific darkness, this specific warmth, this specific moment of being alive in a body that is doing the work of rest without asking your permission. Just as Kasibharadvaja's field received the rain opening, softening, becoming ready for what would grow, let yourself open now to what is already here. The gift of the largeness, the gift of the not knowing, the gift of being held by a world that is wider and stranger and more generous than any ledger can contain. And as that spaciousness settles in you, as the 500 plows grow quiet in the valley of the mind, one final story reaches toward us through the centuries. We do not travel far this time. We stay inside the vast dark, inside this breath, inside this moment that is already complete. And we listen to what the night itself has always been trying to say. If sleep is close, let it come now. You have plowed enough for one evening. The harvest comes in its own time. Snow fell on Echigo all through the night. It fell in the particular way it falls in that remote coastal province on the western edge of Japan's main island, not urgently, not with the drama of a storm, but with a patience so complete it seemed less like weather and more like a decision the sky had made long ago and was now quietly following through on. By midnight, the small mountain hermitage on the lower slopes of Mount Kugami was buried to its eaves in white. The pine trees that surrounded it on three sides had become rounded shapes, soft-edged, their branches bowed under accumulated weight. The path that led down to the village had disappeared entirely beneath a surface, so smooth and unbroken it looked like the world had forgotten there had ever been a path there at all. Inside the hermitage, an old monk sat. His name was Ryokan, and he was 72 years old, and he was very nearly at the end of his life, though he felt no particular urgency about this. The illness that had brought him down from his solitary mountain life several years earlier had settled into his body the way winter settles into the province of Echigo completely, without drama. as though it had always been there and was simply now making itself known in a more direct way. He sat on his sleeping mat in the single small room of the hermitage that was being lent to him by a patron's family who lived in the village below. And he breathed, and he listened to the snow. The snow did not make a sound. This was one of the things he had always loved about it, the way heavy snowfall produced not silence exactly, but something denser than silence. A quality of absorption, as though the snow were taking all the ordinary sounds of the world and holding them gently in its body. Muffled, softened, kept. The wind that had been moving through the pine branches all evening had also gone quiet. Everything had gone quiet. The world outside the thin wooden walls of the hermitage was entirely still. Ryokan breathed in. Ryokan breathed out. He was not thinking about anything in particular. This had been the work of his life, not thinking about things in particular, not arranging his experience into categories and conclusions, not extracting lessons or preparing teachings or managing the distance between himself and what was happening. Simply being where he was, simply letting the snow fall and the silence deepen and the breath move in and out of this old body that had carried him for 72 years through a life so simple that most people who heard about it thought he must be leaving something out. He was not leaving anything out. The hermitage on the mountain with its one room and its leaking roof. The daily walks through the village with his begging bowl, which he sometimes forgot to bring because he had stopped to play catch with the children in the road and the afternoon had somehow become evening. The poems he wrote on whatever was available, strips of bark, the backs of letters, the hems of his robe when nothing else was near. The calligraphy he gave away almost as fast as he made it, to the old woman down the road who always gave him extra bean cake, to the children who asked for it, to anyone who seemed to want it. The long winters in Echigo, when the snow came early and stayed late, and the hermitage was buried, and the only sound was his own breathing, and the occasional weight of snow sliding off the roof in a soft collapse. This had been his life. All of it. Exactly this. He had a reputation, in the region and beyond it, that puzzled him slightly, the reputation of a great Zen master, a poet of rare gifts, a calligrapher whose brushwork moved even people who knew nothing about calligraphy. He did not dispute the calligraphy. He had always found the brush moving in his hand with a naturalness that felt less like skill and more like water finding its level. But the reputation for wisdom he found gently amusing. He called himself Daigu, the great fool. This was not false modesty. It was his honest assessment. He had spent 50 years as a monk, and the main thing he had learned was that he did not know very much, and that not knowing was not a problem. That not knowing was, in fact, something very close to peace, he thought now, in the snow quiet of the winter night, of the young nun Teishin, who would come in the morning. She had been coming every few days in these last months, traveling through the snow from wherever she was staying, bringing food that was better than what he ate alone, and a quality of company that he had not expected at his age, but had received with the same openness he received, everything without grasping, without the wish that it were otherwise than it was, with simple gratitude for its presence while it was present. She was 29 and he was 72. They exchanged poems the way some people exchange breath, as naturally as that. As necessarily. She would arrive in the morning with the snow on her robes and her cheeks red from the cold, and she would sit across from him, and they would write, and the writing would feel like the most adequate response to being alive that either of them had found. He had written to her once, "In this dream world, we nap and speak of dreams. Dream. Dream on as much as you want." This was his understanding of things. A dream world. Not dismissively, he did not mean that it was unreal or unimportant. He meant that it had the quality of dreams, vivid, immediate, arising from causes he did not fully understand, dissolving into other dreams. The snow outside was a dream. The small fire in the corner of the room, burned down now to embers, was a dream. His own breath was a dream. And all of it, every part of it. The cold and the quiet and the leaking roof and the bowl of plain rice he had eaten for dinner and the poems he had written and the poems he had given away and the children's faces when they caught the ball he threw and the woman's extra bean cake and the calligraphy with the missing character and the calligraphy with the extra one, and every single day of this entirely ordinary life was beautiful, was worth exactly this degree of attention, was worth being awake for, even now. Even on this quiet, snowy night at the end of everything, he picked up a small brush that was lying beside him on the mat. He dipped it in the inkstone that was always kept ready. He wrote, on a piece of paper that was already folded into a square, 4 lines. Not a teaching, not a summary, just what was true right now. In this room, in this body, on this night. He set the brush down. He set the paper down. He breathed. The snow continued its patient work outside the walls. He thought, the pines are heavy with it. They bow, but they don't break. This is the thing about the pines. They receive what comes. The snow is not the enemy of the pines. The snow is simply what this season brings, and the pines receive it, and they bend. And in the morning when the sun arrives, if the sun arrives, the snow will slide from them in great soft falls, and they will straighten again, and they will be exactly the pines they were before. The season passes through them. They remain. He had been a pine for 72 years without knowing it. Or perhaps he had known it, in the way you know things that you understand too completely to put into words. The grief of his mother's death while he was still a young monk, learning to practice in a world, suddenly missing the person who had known him longest. The news of his father's death by his own hand in Kyoto, and Ryokan receiving that news alone on a mountain and sitting with it through a long night until it settled into something he could carry without being destroyed by it. The fire that burned part of the hermitage one autumn, and him moving into the old Shinto shrine nearby for 10 years, which had not been so bad. The shrine had its own quality of quiet, and the local farmers left offerings at the gate, and he had written some of his best poems in those years. All of it received. All of it held. Not in the way of a person who does not feel he felt everything. Always. The cold was cold. The loneliness was loneliness. The grief was grief. But underneath the feeling, something steady. Something that had no name and did not need one. Something that continued through every season, the way the mountain continued through every season, entirely there, entirely present, requiring nothing to be different in order to remain exactly itself. He closed his eyes. The embers in the corner gave off a warmth he could feel on his left side, a warmth specific enough to have direction, faint enough to be tender. The smell of the room was cedar and ash and the faint animal warmth of the body, and underneath all of it, the snow smell coming through the gaps in the wooden walls. That particular mineral clarity that belongs only to the air in heavy snowfall. He breathed it in. He let it fill the lungs of this body that had been breathing for 72 years without once being asked to stop. He thought, how many breaths? He had no idea how many breaths. Tens of millions. Perhaps hundreds of millions. Each one given. Not one of them earned or asked for. Not one of them negotiated. Simply arriving, the way snow arrives, patient, reliable, present, asking nothing in return for its presence except to be received. He had received them all, or tried to, some days better than others. Some years he had breathed and not noticed. Some years the breath had been the only thing he noticed. This year, in these last months, the breath had become very loud to him again, not in a frightening way, but in the way that things become loud when they are nearing their end. The way the sound of rain is loudest in the last few minutes before it stops. He was not afraid. He had never particularly understood fear in relation to death, though he understood it in other contexts. Fear made sense when there was something to protect, when the self was something that could be lost. He had spent 50 years learning that the self was less solid than it appeared, less like a stone and more like a river, continuous in its name, but different in every moment of its actual substance. What was there in such a river? To lose? The river did not fear reaching the sea. It simply arrived. He would arrive. He opened his eyes. The room was very dark now, the embers down to their last faint orange. The darkness had the quality that deep winter darkness has in a snowbound place, not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of accumulation, as though the dark itself were as layered and dense as the snow outside, holding everything in it that had ever happened in this room. He had been happy here. He had been happy in the hermitage on the mountain. He had been happy in the Shinto shrine for those 10 years when the shrine was his home. He had been happy on the long, wandering pilgrimage after his teacher's death, sleeping in doorways and under trees, begging his way across Japan. He had been happy playing catch with the children in the road until the afternoon became evening and his alms bowl was empty because he had forgotten to use it. He had been happy writing poems that he gave away. He had been happy receiving poems from Taishin, who would come in the morning with the snow on her robes. Not every moment had felt like happiness. He was not composing a record of a life without shadow. The cold had sometimes been very cold. The loneliness had sometimes been very alone. But underneath all of it, as consistent as the mountain's presence and as quiet as the snow's continuing accumulation, there had always been this gratitude. Not for the comfort, not for the easiness, for all of it. For the cold that required him to find warmth, for the loneliness that required him to find company in the sound of the rain, for the empty bowl that required him to walk to the village and encounter, on the way, the children running toward him with their arms open, for the leaking roof that required him to put a bucket under the drip and listen, through the night, to the particular music of water striking wood. He breathed. Outside, the snow continued. He did not reach for the brush again. He had said what needed to be said. The poem was written and folded and set aside for Taishin to find in the morning. Whatever happened between now and the morning was its own territory, requiring nothing from him except this continued breathing, this receptive quiet, this willingness to remain exactly here until here was somewhere else. The embers faded. The room grew darker. The cold pressed gently through the walls, the way cold does when the fire has gone entirely, not aggressively, not as an attack, but with the patience of something that has been waiting outside all along, simply waiting for the fire to finish. He let it come. He let his eyes close again, and this time he did not open them. He sat in the way he had always sat, the way his teacher had shown him, the way his teacher's teacher had shown before that. The way the tradition had carried the sitting posture forward through centuries, like a river carrying water from one mountain to the next, stable, open, entirely present. His hands rested in his lap. His spine was straight. His face was loose, the jaw soft, the brow smooth. He breathed in, once more, the snow air of Echigo province on a winter night in the year 1831. He breathed out, and somewhere in that breathing out, the boundary between sitting and sleeping dissolved. The way ice dissolves when the morning warms, not dramatically, not with announcement, but simply and completely into something it had always been a form of. Rest now. You have traveled far tonight. Across the warm forests of Thailand and the granite mountains of Korea, through the tea rooms of Tang Dynasty China and the rice terraces of medieval Vietnam, into the high cold plateau of Tibet and the monastery kitchens of medieval Japan and the ploughing fields of ancient Magadha. All of those places are inside you now. All of those teachers are present. All of that wisdom is doing its quiet work. The way snow does its quiet work, settling, deepening, covering what was rough with something soft, something white, something that asks nothing of you except to be received. The breath is here, exactly as it has always been, arriving without being asked, departing without announcement, returning again. Each breath a small beginning, each breath a small completion, each breath a gift you did not earn and have received 10,000 times tonight without noticing. Notice now, just this once, this last time, before sleep takes you completely. This breath, in, this warmth, this dark, this weight of the body that has carried you faithfully through all the days of your life and is now, finally, doing what it has always known how to do, releasing, sinking, dissolving into the larger quiet, the way a snowflake dissolves when it touches the warmth of the ground. Not destroyed, simply returning to what it came from. You do not need to understand this. You do not need to remember it. Let it be the way snow is. Let it fall where it falls. Let it cover what needs covering. Let it soften what has been hard. Let it rest, silent and complete, over everything. The old monk on his mountain is at rest. The snow is still falling. You are held. You have traveled a long way tonight, from the forests of northeast Thailand, where a young woman learned to count what she had been given rather than measure what she lacked, through the granite mountains of medieval Korea, where a monk discovered that simply trying imperfectly, persistently, genuinely is itself a kind of offering that is received, into the cedar-scented tea rooms of Tang Dynasty China, where a merchant finally tasted the cup that had been in his hands all along, across the river valleys of Vietnam, where a king walked away from the greatest military victories of his age and found on a mountain what no victory had ever delivered, up through the cold plateau of Tibet, where a widow stood at the edge of a river and discovered that the door to grief and the door to gratitude are the same door, into the monastery kitchen of medieval Japan, where a cook learned that receiving what is already here is more important than measuring it correctly, down into the ploughing fields of ancient Magadha, where a farmer so busy with his work that he had never looked up found a wandering monk standing at the edge of his field with something he hadn't known to ask for. and finally into the snowbound hermitage of Echigo province, where an old monk sat in the dark and breathed and let the embers cool and needed nothing to be different from exactly what it was. 8 traditions, 8 centuries, or 12, or 25. 8 lives entirely unlike yours and entirely like yours in the ways that have always mattered most. What did they all discover? Not the same thing arrived at from different directions. The same thing, exactly the same thing, again and again. In every cultural setting and every time period and every human circumstance, the teachers of Asia encountered across millennia of paying very close attention to what actually brings a heart to rest. They discovered that the grateful heart is not a heart that has been given more than other hearts. It is a heart that has learned to see what was always there. The food that arrived without being earned. The breath that came and came and came without once being asked. The unnamed hands that built the road you walked on, grew the food you ate, taught the language in which you think your thoughts, preserved the wisdom that reached you tonight across centuries of careful transmission. The warmth that is in this room right now, which you did not produce and did not negotiate for, and which is simply here, asking nothing in return for its presence. This is what they found. All of them, in all those different places. Katanyuta, knowing what has been done for you, not performed, not obligatory, not the gratitude of someone keeping a ledger of debts, the gratitude of clear seeing, the gratitude that arrives naturally when the mind stops for long enough to actually touch what is here. When it sets down the measuring cup and picks up the cup itself. When it steps back from the accounting long enough to notice that it has always been inside the gift, that it has never been anywhere else. These reflections are offered in the spirit of contemplation, not as medical or therapeutic advice, but as ancient company for a tired evening, from traditions that have been keeping this kind of company for a very long time. If any of it reaches you, let it reach you quietly, below the level of analysis. If any of it does not reach you tonight, it may arrive on some other morning when you are not expecting it. The way rain arrives in its own time, in its own way, without needing your permission. This is what the teachers promised. Not immediate transformation, not a guaranteed experience. Only this, that wisdom received in the quiet hours does its work in the quiet. That seeds planted in the dark grow in the dark. That you will likely not know. In any single moment you can point to exactly when this evening changed something. But something will have changed. Something always does. When a person has spent several hours in the company of people who understood genuinely and deeply and from the inside out what it means to be grateful to be alive. Take a breath now. Slowly, in through the nose, down into the belly, the chest following, and out, long and slow and complete. That breath, just now, that specific breath, at this specific hour, in this particular body will never come again. It was entirely itself. It was entirely yours. It was, in the most literal sense the word can carry, a gift. You did not manufacture it. It arrived. Everything tonight arrived. Let that be enough. If you found something useful in these stories, something that settled, something that loosened, something that arrived in your chest as warmth rather than thought, we would be so grateful if you shared this video with someone who might need it. A friend who is struggling, a family member who cannot sleep, a stranger on the other side of the world, sitting in their own dark room, counting what they have lost instead of what they have been given. Your sharing is how these old teachings continue to travel, the way the ancient teachers themselves traveled on foot, across difficult terrain, toward whoever needed what they carried. If these stories have been a companion on your evening, a like or a subscription is simply a way of saying, yes, come back. And we will. There are more traditions to visit. More teachers who understood the grateful heart. More nights, exactly like this one, waiting to be filled with the particular kind of company that asks nothing of you except to breathe and to listen and to let what has always been here finally be received. Tomorrow morning, when you open your eyes, something will be the first thing you see. A ceiling, a window, the shape of the room assembling itself in the early light. Notice it, not as scenery, as gift. This room that held you through the night, this light that arrives, faithful as it has arrived every morning of your entire life, without once failing to come. You may notice that the ordinary day looks slightly different tomorrow. Not dramatically, not the kind of different that requires explanation or announces itself with fanfare. Simply the way the world looks when someone has spent the night in the company of people who knew how to see it. A little more vivid at the edges, a little more dense with meaning in the places that usually seem empty. The cup of morning tea, the sound of the house settling, the face of someone you love, which has been there all along and which deserves, at least once, to be seen as the gift it actually is. You are held right now, by the bed beneath you, by the dark around you, by the long patience of the world that has been sustaining you from your first breath to this one, and has not once, not for a single instant let you go. Rest in that holding now. Let the teachers dissolve back into their mountains and their forests and their rivers and their snow. Let the stories release their edges and become simply warmth, simply quiet, simply the faint sense of having been in good company on a long night. Let your body be heavy. Let your face be soft. Let the breath move on its own. It knows the way. It has always known the way. You have never needed to teach it anything. You have been given this night. You have been given this breath. You have been given this darkness and this warmth and this particular stillness that belongs only to the deepest hour, when everything stops and the world simply is. Receive it. Receive all of it. And sleep now, in the knowledge that what you were given tonight does not require you to stay awake to keep it. It is already yours. It will be there in the morning, quieter than you expect, doing exactly what all true things do, not demanding to be recognized, simply continuing, the way the old monk's breath continued, the way the snow continued falling, the way the heart continues its faithful work, beat after beat after uncountable beat, asking nothing, giving everything, receiving whatever comes with the open hands of something that has understood all along what it means to be alive in a world as generous as this one. Good night. Sleep well. You are enough. You have always been enough. The gratitude that was waiting for you was never somewhere else. It was here. It is here. It will be here when you wake. Rest now